So today we're going to look at efforts in Slovakia, Hungary, and France immediately after World War II. And I know that many of you are sort of interested and focused on, and as we all are, on what is today and what happens today and what's possible today. But I think it's important for us to also understand the history, where we're coming from on this issue. Where did it start? What did it happen? What were the approaches of governments and what were the approaches of advocates at that time? So I think that's why we wanted to do this, bring together this really distinguished panel to help us sort of think through and understand what the obstacles were, what happened, and maybe to take from that lessons as to how we can continue this struggle for justice as we go forward today and in the future. So the panel, so today we have three members. Firstly, Dr. Anna Cichopek-Gajraj. I hope I got that right. Close enough, close enough. Associate Professor of History at Arizona State University. Welcome. Dr. Shannon Fogg, who's a Professor of History at Missouri University of Science and Technology, and Dr. Borbála Klacsmann, who's an independent historian based in Hungary. What we're going to do is have each panel member speak, and then we'll take questions to all of them at the end of the presentation. If you do have any questions, please put them into the chat box at any time, or the question box at the bottom of the screen. We'll be looking at them throughout the webinar, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the time that we have. So firstly, I'm going to ask Anna to talk about early restitution efforts in Slovakia. So Anna's research focuses on Polish-Jewish relations, on anti-Semitism and ethnic violence in Poland and the Polish-Jewish diaspora after the Holocaust. Her book, Beyond Violence, Jewish Survivors in Poland and Slovakia in 1944 to 1948, was a finalist of the 2016 Jordan Schnitzer Book Award and a recipient of the 2015 Barbara Helt Prize honorable mention. So we're really delighted, Anna, to have you with us, and look forward to just helping us set the stage on what happened in Slovakia, and maybe we'll think about what we can learn from that. So Anna, thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope I'm unmuted. You can hear me.
Perfectly, got you perfectly.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this invitation. I'm truly honored and thrilled to be here. And let me just say a few words about this. It's a short outline of a story of post-war, of restitution efforts in the first years after the war in Slovakia. So during the war, Slovakia was under the leadership of Józef Tiso, and it was allied with Nazi Germany and thus had significant autonomy in its domestic affairs, including the so-called Jewish question. And within this autonomy and within that control, it conducted the thorough redistribution of Jewish property among ethnic Slovaks, mainly among ethnic Slovaks, even with the exclusion of Germans in Slovakia. During the war, the wartime Aryanization Acts of 1940 really set a pace the expropriation of Jewish property. During the deportations to Auschwitz and other death camps in Poland, deportations which were conducted by the Slovak state beginning in March 1942, during those deportations, the Slovak government authorized the confiscation of all Jewish property which was abandoned, left behind by the deported Jews. There were two consequences of this wartime Slovak history. One, it was the autonomous wartime Slovak state under Józef Tiso that was largely responsible for most of Jewish expropriation during the war. And two, large portion of a Slovak population benefited directly or indirectly from the spoliation of the Jews, and thus was determined then to safeguard those new acquisitions. After the war, restitution of Jewish property became one of the, came up almost immediately when Jewish survivors were slowly coming back to their communities of origin. The Jewish community before the Second World War oscillated between 89 and 90,000 population. After the war, about between 28 and 33,000 survivors came back. For Slovak Jews and for Jewish organizations, the Jewish institutions that represented Slovak Jewish survivors, restitution was not merely a matter of material survival. As Gideon mentioned, right, property is much more than just material assets. For Slovak Jews, for Slovak survivors, it carried symbolic meaning. It was about justice, right? Restitution of Jewish property was about justice, was about undoing the harm done by the Slovak state during the war. The Slovak Jews rightly believed that the post-war Slovak government should have a moral obligation to undo the wrong of its predecessor. Not only moral obligation, but also moral responsibility as a successor of a Slovak, wartime Slovak state. Post-war Slovak government, however, was not driven by the kind of sense of moral obligation. It's instead, it was politics, right? It had to pragmatically walk a very tight rope between rewarding those who were fighting against fascism during the war, without severely punishing those who served fascism during the war. Józef Tiso, after the war, he was imprisoned and was awaiting trial. He was still very popular after the war. Slovak nationalism, stoked by years of independence before and during the war, was on the high. Anti-Czech, anti-Magyar sentiments were on the high. Anti-Jewish sentiments as well. Slovak government understood that any appearance of favoring Jews, quote unquote, would stir social unrest. And they were not completely wrong about it, considering outbreaks of pogroms in Topolčane in 45 or in Bratislava, right? We had anti-Jewish riots in 46 and 48. So in this equation, in this context, there was really very little room to hear and satisfy Jewish claims. And of course, we need to also remember general trends toward nationalization in the first years after the war and so on. Still, within this context, general restitution laws, which were not only considered Jewish property, but property in general, Czechoslovak restitution laws passed after the war were as generous as similar laws elsewhere in Europe at the time. The problem were not the laws, legal acts, but their implementation in Slovakia, especially. And I should note that even after the Second World War, Slovakia had quite a large extent of autonomy within the post-war Czechoslovakia. So these restitution laws, there were two major legal restitution acts after the war. One was Beneš decree. Edvard Beneš was the president of Czechoslovakia, and he issued the executive order in May 1945. So this is one. And the second was the restitution law, which was passed by the Czechoslovak parliament almost exactly a year later in May 1946. So the first decree, the President Beneš decree, what did it do? It invalidated all property transactions which were made after the Munich Agreement in 1938, in September 1938. And I quote, all the property transactions made under duress of occupation and threat of national, racial, and political persecution, end of quote. So that definitely covered Jewish property. The problem was that Beneš's executive decree did not legally bind Slovak territories. It had to be authorized by the Slovak legislature and Slovak executive. His decree was not authorized in the Slovak territories, and thus all the Aryanization, all the property transfers done during the Second World War were not invalidated. So as a result, for a year after the Second World War, Slovak Jewish survivors had no legal recourse to claim their homes, their businesses, etc. When they came, what happened was often their property, their homes, their businesses were managed by so-called national managers who were ethnic Slovaks appointed by the local administration. At times, actually, Slovak Jews could become national managers of their own property after the war. So this is a complicated, I can speak more in Q&A about it, but that was one way to get a hold of one business, for example. Communal property like synagogues, houses of prayers, Jewish hospitals, and other buildings of Jewish communal life were returned for use after the war, in these immediate years after the war. But individual property restitution was an unsolved issue until May 1946, when the second legal act passed, right? The restitution law passed by the Czechoslovak parliament. This law, again, did very similar thing, right? Invalidated all the property transactions made during the war. And importantly, it added that district courts were now authorized to enforce the restitution. And this law was then implemented in the Slovak territories. Unfortunately, it was briefly suspended because there were riots after the riots in anti-Jewish riots in Bratislava in August 1946. The restitution was blamed for the rise in anti-Jewish sentiments, and the law was suspended, but then the suspension was called off. And just to say, despite all this, right, some restitution actually did happen. By December 1947, many homes, small Jewish farms, small Jewish businesses, including rural businesses, were restituted. However, the significant portion of Jewish assets remained property of the state. And in 1947, actually, Czechoslovak parliament allocated all hairless Jewish property for a special economic fund, which had really nothing to do with rehabilitation of Jewish victims. So effectively, all Jewish assets were passed to the state. After communist coup d'etat, after communist coup in February 1948, most Slovak Jews actually left the country, 80% of Slovak Jews. Most property was anyway nationalized. So this issue really only came back to the fore after 1991, after collapse of communism, and then in 1993, with a re-establishment of independent Slovakia. So this is a very brief outline. Thank you so much for your attention.
Great, thank you. Fascinating. It's just so interesting to kind of learn about and think about the history of stuff that we deal with so much, but just understanding that history just so important. Thank you. Okay, so let's continue on, and then we'll have time for questions. Just to remind everyone, if you put any questions in the box, in the question box, please do that, and then we can also, I may pose those questions to everyone, because I think, as you'll hear, there's a lot of common themes of from what you heard from Anna. And now let's turn to Bori. So thank you, Dr. Borbála Klacsmann. Is an independent Holocaust historian based in Hungary. Her areas of expertise include the microhistory of the Hungarian Holocaust and the restitution and compensation of Holocaust survivors. So this is right in her lane, and it's just great to have you share that expertise. She completed her doctoral studies at the Department of History at the University of Szeged in 2021. She's worked in the past for the Holocaust Memorial Center, the Anne Frank House, and the Yad Vashem Archives, certainly all places deep with deep resources that our sister organization, the Claims Conference, has proud to work with wonderful institutions. She's organized 6 international conferences and participated in many research projects. And her articles, both in the popular sphere and the scientific sphere, have been published in 3 languages. And she's author of the Popular History Facebook page, which I am not going to try and pronounce. We could probably put it in the chat box for anyone who wants to look it up. Maybe we could do that, put that in the chat box for anyone who's interested in that. So, Bori, interested to get your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this panel.
If you could just speak up a little. I'm not sure I can hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, that's
okay,
great.
So I have a PowerPoint, as you can see, and I'm going to start the screening. So as Gideon has said, I'm dealing with the restitution in Hungary, not only the early restitution, but also restitution and compensation during the Holocaust, the socialist period. So actually, Hungary was in a very similar situation as Slovakia. It was allied with Germany, but it was very independent during the war, except from 1944, when, for various reasons, which I'm not going to talk about, Germany occupied Hungary. But let's start with the property confiscation. It took place in various phases. First, with the anti-Jewish laws, which started in 1938. And here you can see a historical picture of a Jewish person reading a decree about what they have to give up to the state, what is going to be confiscated. And the state confiscations continued after the German occupation, but at a much faster speed, mainly through decrees. And then during the course of the ghettoization and the deportations, Jewish property was collected at various places, for instance, in synagogues, just like in this picture, which is from Szeged, or in bigger Jewish houses. And of course, there was a redistribution of Jewish property to non-Jews, and also in many places lootings took place, just like you can see here in the last picture. So after the Jews were deported from a locality, the local non-Jews went into the ghettos and they took whatever they could find, or they broke into closed-off Jewish houses or shops and did the same. And the post-war restitution was also very similar to the process in Slovakia. So there were many decrees and laws concerning the restitution. Here I made a short list about the most important ones. So there is already a decree in 1945 which revoked all anti-Jewish laws, and Decree 300 of 1946 gave the survivors the right to get back any Aryanized property. And also these two laws, Act 25 of 1946, it said that a fund should be established which would aid the penniless or poor survivors. And it was supposed to also handle heirless property. And this was actually a very good, so it would have been very nice to have it, but I will talk a little bit about this, but it happened much later than it was supposed to help the survivors. And Act 18 of 1947, which was basically the Paris Peace Treaty, enacted, it promised restitution for everyone, including, of course, Hungarian Jews. And the Hungarian state also established two institutions which were supposed to deal with the restitution. The first one was the Government Commission for Abandoned Property, which existed between 1945 and 47. It was under the Prime Minister's office, and its task was helping those who had lost property, maintaining so-called abandoned property, and providing partial restitution. However, there were several problems with this. Because its functioning was paid and the expenses were paid from the rent fees paid for abandoned apartments and houses, which would of course have had to be paid to the original owners, and that never happened. It was also very bureaucratic, and the Jewish community found it very offensive that the same institution handled the property of the deported Jews and also the property of German-friendly escaped civil servants and relocated Germans, etc., because obviously they also had abandoned property, quotation marks. Now, the National Jewish Restitution Fund was established in 1947, and this was the fund the Act 25 of 1946 talked about. Of course, 1 year later, this fund was established, which is, I think it was quite late, because by that time, the survivors, of course, already had to have some kind of economic background. However, the positive side of this fund was that it focused only on heirless Jewish property, and it had the right to get all of these heirless properties. The aim was, as originally in the law, to aid the poor survivors. Until 1953, this fund collected 3 million forints on a bank account. However, by the time it started to sell these real estates and collect all this money from which it was supposed to aid the survivors, already 4 or 5 years passed since the end of the war. And moreover, of course, the socialist period also hampered the goal of the fund. And in the end, they didn't give anything to the survivors. So basically, there was no restitution. This whole process failed because, first of all, the national economy collapsed after the war. Hungary was, of course, on the losing side. Many people from the lower social strata received Jewish property, and the political parties didn't want to lose their base, their social base, of course. And moreover, the political parties themselves also benefited from the confiscations. They also claimed Jewish property. And in many cases, the redistributed Jewish goods were either sold or renovated by the new owners. And of course, it was much more complicated to get back something from the third or fourth person who bought it from the original owner. And there was also fear of anti-Semitism. Of course, in Hungary, there were pogroms too, just like in Slovakia. So this was another reason why politicians failed to implement the restitution. And I brought 2 case studies from my previous research, which I thought would be interesting for the public. The first one is the restitution case of the Popper printing house. This was a very famous printing house in Monor. You can see in the map here, down there, it's Monor, and this is Budapest, so it was not far from the capital at all. The Popper family lived here in Monor, and Ernő Popper, his father was a bookbinder, So it was basically in the family to deal with books. And Ernő Popper established this printing house and also a stationery shop. This printing house became very famous, as I have said, and many famous poets, Hungarian poets and writers published their books there. In 1944, the printing house was confiscated from the family, and all of the male family members were conscripted to military labor service, while the rest of the family was deported in July 1944. Ernő Popper, his wife, their daughter and grandchild perished in Auschwitz. And only László Popper, Ernő's son, returned after the war. He reclaimed this printing house, which he managed to get back. Of course, it was a very famous, valuable, so it would have been hard to deny the origin of this property. However, in 1949, when socialism started in Hungary, this printing house was nationalized without remuneration. And László Popper worked at a stationery shop until retirement, but he was not employed in his own shop. So this is a story I think many survivors suffered the same. Even though they managed to get back their property after the war, they lost it again during the socialist period and the nationalization. And the second case study is that of József Worcel's furniture. This is based on a letter which was sent from Újpest to Alsógöd in April 1945. A policeman wrote this letter to the notary of Alsógöd, and in the letter he says that József Worcel, who is a Jew and a survivor from Újpest, reported Mrs. István Fischler from Alsógöd, who had hit him during the Holocaust, so she was a rescuer. However, according to the letter, Worcel was forced to flee during his hiding, and he left his valuable furniture at Mrs. Fischler's house. When he returned, the furniture was gone, and Mrs. Fischler said that she had a part of the furniture brought to Germany and another part to Újpest. And when Worcel looked for the man in Újpest to whose house Mrs. Fischler brought the furniture, he said that she had never transported anything there. According to the letter, the damage was 40,000 penge, which was a very big sum at the time. Now we can see that there could be two solutions to this case. The first one is that Mrs. Fischler told the truth, and Béla Balog, Mr. Balog, took the furniture. Or the second solution is that Mrs. Fischler lied, and then she was the one who took the furniture. And from this case, it turns out that, which is, I think, quite common phenomenon, that during the Holocaust, those who rescued Jews either and took them under their wings, either the Jewish party felt that they have to pay for the rescue, or due to their vulnerable position, they were forced to do so by the rescuer. And I believe that we have the second solution here. I think that it was Mrs. Fischler who took this furniture, and she felt entitled to it because she helped Worcel to hide. So as a summary, we can see that these restitution cases reflect Jewish, non-Jewish relations. So they are not only a historical story, but they have very different aspects. And also the attitude of the state and the local authorities, the obstacles that the survivors faced upon their return, and the fact that plenty of various institutions were involved, both in the confiscation process and in the restitution too. So it was a very chaotic process, and that's another reason why the survivors rarely got back their properties. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Bori. That's really fascinating. I mean, I know people have questions and thoughts, but what I'm going to do is let's take the third presentation and then let's circle back for sort of a question or a discussion. And if you guys have questions of each other, feel free also to jump in. Great. So Shannon, would love to hear your thoughts. Dr. Shannon Fogg is Professor of History at Missouri University of Science and Technology. Her research focuses on the history of daily life in France during and after the Second World War. And she examines the relationship between individuals and the state during the war and the Holocaust. Two books that she's the author of: The Politics of Everyday Life in Vichy France, Foreigners, Undesirables, and Strangers, and Stealing Home, Looting, Restitution, and Reconstituting Jewish Lives in France, 1942 to 1947. So Shannon, thank you for joining us. It's wonderful to have you with us. And we'd love to hear your thoughts and background on these early efforts in France.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us and for the invitation. And I think you'll see that there are a lot of themes that are overlapping and a lot of things that are very much the same, whether we're in Eastern Europe or Western Europe. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about immediate post-war restitution attempts in France. And I will start by saying that there were many kinds of items looted in France during the war. They're often grouped into various categories, and each of these categories had their own restitution process. But what I'm going to focus on today is the looting and restitution of private apartments in Paris, because it affected Jewish families from various social, economic, and national backgrounds. And it has that personal importance that Gideon mentioned earlier. The other thing in France is that most people did not own their own apartments. And so the physical space belonged to someone else, but the items inside belonged to Jewish families, and those looted possessions became part of the post-war restitution process. So a little context on looting. As early as June 1940, the Nazis began their systematic pillage of France, focusing first on artwork and other cultural objects. By the winter of 1941 and 1942, the major Jewish art and book collections in France had been transferred to Germany, and the Nazis began to implement the final solution in Europe. And it was in this context that Alfred Rosenberg sent a letter to Adolf Hitler in December 1941. And in that letter, he cited the severe lack of furniture in Eastern territories under his control. And as a result, he asked that his services in Paris be permitted to strip uninhabited Jewish homes throughout Western Europe. As a result, the Nazis launched a coordinated assault on Jewish homes and personal possessions in France during the spring of 1942 with something that was known as the furniture operation. Hitler approved Rosenberg's request, and the transfer of goods from Western to Eastern Europe officially began on January 14th, 1942. The first train loads of pillaged goods headed east in April, also in 1942. And by the time the furniture operation ended in August of 1944, over 38,000 apartments in Paris had been emptied, and that was approximately 674 train loads of goods sent to the east. As part of this process, authorities sealed the Parisian apartments of arrested or absent Jews until a French moving company could completely strip the residence of its furnishings. Items were then transferred to various depots throughout the city, where they were sorted, packaged, and then later shipped to Germany or further east for distribution. Once an apartment had been emptied, the apartment could then be rented to new tenants. So at the end of the war, some Jewish survivors returned to homes that were now inhabited by other families or were completely empty. And the French provisional government instituted a series of ordinances that were meant to help return property based on the Republican ideals of equality. So one of the very first laws was the Ordinance of November 14th, 1944, and it was meant to allow individuals to reclaim their former homes. Original occupants could request to return to their home, even if that apartment had been re-rented, if they had been obligated to leave the habitation without consent. However, the current tenants would not be removed from the apartment if they were a bombing victim, an evacuee, a refugee, or the spouse or close relative of a prisoner of war, a mobilized soldier, or a political or labor deportee. So there's a wide range of exemptions, which made it, it's that question of implementation. The law is there, but how do you implement it? And there is also this idea that leases weren't really an item. So it wasn't something that could be despoiled, but it was also something that could not be returned. So the leases were kind of a tricky situation. Recovered personal possessions, however, could be returned to their owners, but it would take the government longer to address these matters. It was not until January 30th of 1945 that the provisional government officially created the Restitution Service of the Goods of the Victims of Despoilment Laws and Measures, a very long title, and that was under the Ministry of Finance. And it was meant to attempt to return confiscated goods to their rightful owners. The first ordinance related to the recovery of furniture did not appear until April 11th, 1945, which was nearly 8 months after the liberation of Paris. And all of these laws, French war victims, whether they were racial victims, political victims, or just a victim of the circumstances of war, were all meant to be treated equally by these laws. The April 11th, 1945 ordinance required victims of the furniture operation to send a detailed inventory to the new restitution service. And this was the first step in the attempt to reclaim some lost possessions. And so this is just an example of the kinds of things that you'll see in these inventories. The government collected what they called identifiable domestic pieces, and they only collected items that were recovered in France. They put them on display in depots throughout Paris. And then an individual could ask for permission to go visit the depot to look and see if they recognized any of their personal possessions there. But in order to be able to go to these depots, you had to have sent in an inventory. That inventory had to be certified by the building's concierge, by the local police, and you were supposed to include an estimation of the theft date, which is kind of hard to do if you're not there when it occurs. The chances of recovering items were very slim, but increased if the apartment had been emptied near the end of the war, since those items were more likely to still be in France. So the overall process for restitution was complicated. If your items had been shipped out of France, then that was under the authority of a different government organization. Cars and bicycles had a separate restitution administration. There's a different administration for pianos, for books, for artwork, for jewelry, and for bank accounts. So if you had things in each of those categories, there was a different process for each of those items. The French National Archives hold more than 6,000 dossiers of individuals seeking the restitution of their personal property or their family members' items. And I've looked at those dossiers. This is just a map. Each of the dots represents an address of an apartment that was looted, and then someone filed a restitution claim at the end of the war. And I think one of the things that's interesting in all of these papers is that there are these early measures taken, and these show the active role of Jews in claiming their place back in these societies after the war. French and foreign Jews claimed their place in post-war France through participation in this process. They draw explicitly on their status or their family member status as a racial deportee. They recognize that they were also war victims and bombing victims and soldiers and prisoners of war. They are all calling for equality and justice and recognition as they are trying to recover their stolen items. And as Anna mentioned, these things are practical. Reclaiming lost possessions was practical. It's getting things back that you need for daily life, but it's also very emotional. It's last links to family members who are lost in the Holocaust. This is an example of a letter that's in one of the inventories, and she sends a letter to the director of property who she insistently asks to do everything in his power to return her objects because they're particularly dear because they represented the entire existence of her husband and her children. So the restitution service in France continued to function until July of 1947. At that point, any unclaimed items could be sold, and the proceeds of those sales went to the French government. Of the 38,000 apartments looted and the millions of items they contained, less than 2,000 identifiable pieces were restituted during this process. But these ordinances that nullified wartime spoliation and implemented the restitution process were not just practical, they were explicitly political, as everyone has already mentioned. They are important in France in reestablishing the idea of republicanism after authoritarian rule, and for beginning the process of recognizing the losses of Jews during the war. And I know that was a really quick overview. I have more details in the book that Gideon mentioned earlier, and I'm also continuing to work with these restitution dossiers to learn more about individual experiences, the extent of losses in France, and the active attempts to retrieve personal possessions. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. Really, totally fascinating. So there's a number of questions I see in the chat, and then also a couple in the questions, the Q&A, and I see some people have answered. Thank you for answering those. I guess one sort of general question I'd like to throw out to all three of you really is, what do you think we can learn from the historical experience for how we should address this issue today? You know, and generally, not specifically in the specific countries you study, but what do you think are the most sort of significant things that are relevant today for those who are advocating? And I see in the chat there are people who are have specific claims and issues. Anyone want to dive in on that? Interested to hear all the perspective from all of you, actually, if you would. Anyone want to step up?
I can start.
Please.
So I can speak from the Central European experience. I'm sure that Anna knows this too, the phenomenon of competitive victimhood, which basically comes up in sort of anti-Semitic narratives, such as, we have paid back everything a long time ago. Why are we also paying to the second generation? They are going to live from the restitution up to the 10th generation, talking like this about the survivors and their descendants. And to me, this is really, really frustrating to hear these voices. And I always keep on popularizing my research results so that people see that this is not how it went. Basically, they didn't get any restitution until the fall of the communist regime. And so yeah, this is basically, I think, in every Central and Eastern European country. And yeah, I think it's very important to address this issue, the early restitution, the issue of early restitution, because otherwise people don't know what was going on, especially in this region where the countries were basically, we could say, sort of democratic for a couple of years, and then socialists or communists took over. And the entire restitution and Holocaust issue was swept under the carpet immediately, and people just don't know what happened. I would say not even the second generation knows what happened in that very short period when they were supposed to get restitution, at least for a couple of years before the communist period. So that's my point of view.
Interesting. Anna or Shannon, any thoughts?
No, Dr. Borbála said it right. For Eastern Europe, public opinion truly matters there. And it did matter immediately after the war, and does matter now. And now, as we know, it gets even more complicated. Also, this post-war history is indicative how anti-Semitism plays a role. Kind of these tropes about Jews being favored by governments, Jews being in control, Jews being greedy, wanting money, etc. So these tropes were very much alive after the war. They are very much alive now, and governments, as they were before, they are also very cautious about those public opinion surveys where the public opinion is.
Mm-hmm. Great. Shannon, if you want to, or shall I just jump in with a couple other questions?
Well, I was just going to bring up something that's maybe a little bit different, but I think one of the things that also asks us to kind of look at it is the difference between restitution and reparations. And a lot of when we're talking about restitution, what people were focused on immediately after the war was actually returning items that you could find. And then later came kind of the compensation or discussions about compensation. And then it also becomes a question of who's included in all of these things. And I think we saw that in all of these papers is there was this kind of push towards inclusion, right? That Jews are included with everybody, but in some ways that inclusion with everybody makes it harder to get specific recognition that experiences were different. But then as we start to get further along, who's included changes. And I know in France, it favored French nationals over foreign Jews who had been in the country. And then what about children? Are they included because their names aren't on the leases? And so it's a question of, it's always those kind of widening circles of who's included and who's excluded and how those things change over time.
And actually, just quickly follow up on that. That's exactly right. And Slovakia, we didn't talk about Poland, but in Poland, actually, Jewish survivors were singled out as a particular victim of the war immediately after the war. Slovakia had no such framework. So in Slovak legal acts, Jews were included under the larger umbrella of general restitution.
Mm-hmm. So, I'm looking at the questions here, Anna, in the chat, and what I can see is that we have a group of people here who are extremely knowledgeable, and really thank you all for, there's just so many questions and points there. I think we could do a 2-hour session because clearly you've sparked off a lot of questions from people who clearly have a lot of knowledge and experience. So I'm not quite sure how to pick out from among them because there's just so many thoughtful questions and comments. And what we will try and do is we will circulate all the questions, the chat and the questions to the panelists, and maybe you might sort of pick up ones that you think will be relevant for people, and if somehow we can just share those, that would be great. I guess from among the many questions here, one question was about the role of advocacy, and I've got sort of interested in that in the countries. Someone asked about that. How was the role for the Jewish community in these places and for the international Jewish community? And obviously there was the international organizations, there was the local community. Any thoughts on that? One of the questions I saw raised that issue. Anyone want to jump in?
I can start on this. This is a great question, and it's really speaks to one of the major elements of post-war Jewish history of these immediate years after the war, and that is transnationalism of it all. So Jewish community in Slovakia was very much connected to, especially Jewish philanthropic organizations in the United States, especially joint, of course, American Jewish Distribution Committee, World Jewish Congress, Slovak Jewish organizations. There were two major Jewish organizations in Slovakia at the time. They were not passive. They were constantly sending letters, petitions, complaints. They were constantly in conversation with the Slovak government, with the politicians, trying to push them. They were shaming government to do something. They were making all kinds of arguments. They used mockery. I mean, they were really brought to the brink of desperation by 1946, and really things were not moving forward. Especially Wojciech Winterstein was really very important leader, a voice in post-war Slovakia. So yes, and there is much more to say about it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So one other question I'm interested in, what was the role of governments? Like the American government has played such an important role today, and they certainly did in Germany. I assume in the era that you talked about, and have other governments and have that international voice, was it heard then? And obviously for us, I think one of the lessons to take is just how important having that international focus is. Any thoughts on that from anyone? Any of you?
I will say I did notice in the French context, the French were very concerned about how they would be viewed by other countries, right? This is part of that rebuilding and reestablishing themselves as a Republican country after authoritarian rule. And they're very interested in how the public, but also the American government will view them. And so that's part of that idea of justice and what laws do we put in place, and how we return things will be part of how we are being judged by the wider community. So I would say that was an important influence in some of the things that are happening in the government and in the legal systems.
Interesting. So and what we're going to do with the questions is that we have everyone's email. So there was just so many there. We will, as I say, we will circulate and we will get back to you on specific questions. And I'm sure our panelists will be happy to help us make sure we direct you to resources that can help. One specific question I saw was about the film 1945. I guess this is for you, Bori. I've seen the film. We actually had a webinar with the director of the film, and I strongly recommend people to watch it. Any thoughts that you had on that powerful film? And I guess yes. What's the historian's perspective? Certainly from an emotional one, it was very strong and moving.
I love that movie. I mean, of course, I don't know. The story is fiction, of course, but I think it happened in so many places. If not like this, then in another way. But it was the same everywhere, and I really, really love that movie because it calls the attention to people that this is like how you imagine restitution after the war. It's not like how that happened. And of course it also calls attention to that, even though we are talking about valuables, money, real estate, etc., we are also talking about people who lost their relatives and friends and family. And when I think people tend to forget this, like why are we giving them, why are we giving them the compensation even now? Because they deserve it after what happened. So I really, really like that movie. And I'm actually a bit sad because I think in Hungary it wasn't such a big blast as it was in the international Jewish community, let's say. So I would have pushed it a little bit more here in Hungary.
Okay, so well, thank you for that. I think we're just sort of coming to the end, and I just wanted to take a chance to thank our guests. I'm just mindful of everyone's time. So as I say, we will try and answer all those questions, and thank you for sharing your thoughts. I think everyone's had a chance to read them and see them. So I want to just mention, and there was answering a question, I'll answer one of the questions which asked, have we done any webinars on Poland? And the answer is yes. So on the YouTube channel, for WJRO, for the World Jewish Restitution Organization, you can find the previous webinars, and including this one will be there as well. So if for those of you who haven't seen it, you may want to have a look at that, and certainly the one on 1945, and I love that film as well. So that's great to hear your perspective. Strongly recommend it to anyone. You'll find our other webinars there. And we will continue to keep everyone updated. And I want to just thank both Samantha and particularly Lisa Sherman-Cohen, who really put this together, who reached out to everyone, and who's really done so much to help this community of people who are so committed on this issue, both on the history of what happened, what is important today, together. And I certainly glad that we have this regular opportunity to gather together, and we will keep you updated and come up. I'm sure Lisa will come up with more ideas and thoughts to bring together people. And really, to our panelists, it is just so wonderful for me, who's been involved in this for many years, to see a generation of scholars emerging who take this issue that's so important to Holocaust survivors, to the Jewish world, but really to fundamental issues of justice, and to make sure that the history is understood and what happened. Because I think, as you, all three of you, it came through so beautifully in what you said. These issues are technical and historical on one level, and on another level, they're emotional and personal. And I just think that none of us who care about these issues can understand what we're doing and why it's important without understanding the history. And I just so pleased that there are a generation of scholars who care this way and put what you obviously do incredible amounts of time and energy to understanding this history. So a big thank you to all of you for not only for joining us today, but for what you do. And thank you all for joining and for the many questions and comments. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.